All right, welcome. This is Senior AP English, and our objective for the next few minutes is to introduce the King Arthur motif. The place, however, that I'm going to begin will seem kind of at first maybe a little strange. And I had predicted that I would do this, so I'm going to do it. Let's talk about weapons. Let's talk about weapons, all right? It's kind of interesting. In the history of the world, few topics are more ubiquitous than this topic. Ubiquitous meaning everywhere present. No matter what culture you want to study, you're going to find in that culture that there is a moment in its history when it had to win through conquest, and to do so required weapons. Now, in the history of the martial arts, that is to say the fighting arts, we have a very interesting kind of understanding. Very early on, after the Bronze Age gets, really started, men especially, although not always just men, but men especially will define themselves by the way they fight in hand-to-hand combat. This can be done without weapons or with weapons, and predominantly it is with weapons post-Bronze Age. And the weapon of choice is the sword. That's the weapon of choice, the sword. It becomes then an art form to wield this weapon. Right? I mean, initially when you have a sword and nobody else has a sword, well, that's one thing. You really don't need much for art form. But once you know other people are also swinging swords, then it becomes an art form. Now, the history of the sword is a fascinating history. All over the world, men and cultures rise and fall by two things. The construction of the weapon, the sword, because if you swing it and it breaks, you're in trouble. So how you make this sword becomes really important. And then your ability to wield that weapon in the form of the art itself, of swordplay as it comes to be known. Now, all over the world, these swords take on a life of their own. Are you ready for this? They get names. One of the earliest instantiations of this in the English tradition is in Beowulf. He carries with him a very special sword, so special it's named. The name of the sword is Hrunti. It is a special sword, and it has a history all its own. What is that all about? Well, let's talk about it. In the history of swordplay, once the sword was made, and that could take a really long time, I mean years to make a sword. Once the sword is made, it's given a name. All kinds of special ceremonies that we would today call religious ceremonies are going to be associated with this sword, this weapon. And then it will be handed down from family to family as an heirloom. It's interesting how rarely we will find the sword being buried with the warrior. Now, that's not to say it doesn't happen, but it's far less common than the sword being handed on to the next in line, who would have received some kind of training. You begin to have schools of swordplay. So you actually have academies, kind of like Plato's academy, only you're not learning how to do mathematics or how to, think about the philosophies of the world. Rather, you're learning how to swing a sword, right? Of course, think about it. There's two parts to swinging a sword. There's what you do on offense when you're swinging the sword, and more importantly, there's what you do to defend yourself from someone swinging a sword at you. Ducking is usually not the best option, you see, okay? So the ability to be able to defend yourself, this becomes huge in regards to swordplay and art form itself, okay? Now, all over the world, these swords become really important. And there's all kinds of mythic stories about some of these swords, as in if you're carrying the sword, no kidding, I can tell you, there are stories like this. You're carrying the sword. You can go right into the middle of the war and come out without a scratch if you have the sword on you. You don't even have to pull the sword out of its saber. All you have to do is to have the sword on your side. I can't tell you the number of stories like this. even in the warfare when projectiles start to be used. There are stories of, for example, men carrying swords and nothing happens to them. They don't even have to take the sword out of its saber as long as the sword is there on their side. They are untouchable. Why? Because the sword has magic qualities to it. And these magic qualities start to have a certain kind of reverence over time. So that, for example, they start to be treated as religious icons, these swords. In other words, you do not mess with these swords. Well, I was a brief comment. I'll tell you this, this story. I was myself. I've been interested in swordplay for a number of years, and two stories. One of the my dear colleagues said he gets a phone call from the Smithsonian, and they say, "We've got this sword we think might be really important. We'd like you to take a look at it." He's like, "Oh, all right," because you hear these stories about these famous swords. Oh, all right. And so he takes this sword, and the minute he sees the sword, he's like, yeah, I think this is probably a really, really, really old sword. The way they tested these swords, and there are stories of these swords taking up to 100 years to be made before it's ever actually used in battle. That's what I mean by a long time. One of the ways they said they tested these swords was to take the samurai blade, put it in water, let the water flow against the blade, take small flower petals, drop them upstream. The petals come down, hit the blade. When they are completely severed from nothing more than the force of the water, flow of the water, then the sword is ready. And they just keep working with the sword until it's ready. These are stories my pal had heard. You don't find swords like this every day. And so he decides he's going to test this sword. He takes a big chunk of meat, and he hangs it on his clothesline in his backyard to test the sword. Now, to swing a samurai sword is an art form in itself. There are certain things that one must do. You have to know how to hold the sword. You have to know how to place the sword against the object to which you are going to cut, which is what you do. You kind of lay the sword where you're going, then you rise, and then you do your thing. He lays the sword against the meat, and it severs the meat. The weight of the sword severs the meat. He freaks himself out. He immediately cleans the blade off. He takes it back to the Smithsonian and says, I don't want anything else to do with this sword, but what you have here is an authentic samurai sword. A number of years later, I was privileged in Japan to travel and visit in north of Tokyo in a town called Mito. I was able to visit one of the last standing schools of swordplay called Bushido. And my pal was actually staying in the compound. I was not staying in the compound, but I was visiting this day. And we go into this house where he is staying, and he says that there's a room in this house he's been informed he's not to enter. There are artifacts in there. So I say, so are we entering that room? So of course we do. And we're walking through this room, and there's just all kinds of really, really old stuff. And I look over in a corner, and I see wrapped up what immediately I recognize as a sword. And this is a family that is, for many generations had been teaching swordplay. And I say to my pal, I was like, oh, that looks like a samurai sword. And he was like, yeah, they said something about how in this house there's something that is beyond priceless, like you can't put money on the value of an item, but they didn't say what it was. And I said, I'm pretty sure it's that sword. I was going to unwrap it, and then I was like, no, I don't think I better even touch it. You just don't mess with these swords. This is not unusual in the history of the world. In England, we have a very important history of swords as well. Let's point out, though, how this notion of swordplay becomes part of the Western thinking as well. So, for example, in America, hey, have you seen a Marines commercial? Two observations. Have you seen a Marines commercial? First of all, notice you don't see these guys flabby, fat, looks like they've been doing lots of eating of Doritos line. No, these gentlemen look like they've come out of hard rock, right? Very well chiseled, strong, masculine kinds of men. Have you noticed in every Marine commercial, though, and there's a number of them, there's always a sword. Always a sword. Of course, part of the Marine standard garment. And let's point out, we have the finest military in the world that has ever existed. Our fighting soldiers today are the best trained. These Marines have a sword on their side. Now, let's be fair. When we're fighting in Afghanistan, we're fighting with the very best artillery. We don't carry swords in the field of battle. Why would a Marine in a marine commercial have a sword on his side? The answer in a single word is Excalibur. Excalibur. Now what is that? The Sword of Kings, it's called. Well, what is that? Well, sometime post-Beowulf, we began to understand in English history that everything England is about is derived from a sword. Not just any sword, the sword. Strange women lying in ponds. This is a sword that is derived from an unknown source. It comes from the Lady of the Lake, we are told. Strange women lying in ponds. This Lady of the Lake is a kind of like a fairy, if you will. Okay, this is not real. This is another world, and this sword comes from that place. And this sword, then, two things. One, it gives one the right to win all contests. Okay, so fighting all of a sudden is almost like, it's like a waste of time, because if you have this sword, you're going to win. But more importantly, the sword gives you the right to be ruler. Now, even today in England, if you are going to be what's called knighted, that is to say, given a very special kind of ceremony in England, you are brought into the greatest cathedral in England, where all these really important people show up. The Queen herself waits for you at the front. You walk to the front, you kneel. The Queen then takes out a sword. By the way, it's not Excalibur, but it is the Sword of Kings, and will touch then you two sides of your head and then the top of your head. This sword is then touched. By the way, you can see this sword. It's part of the crown jewels in the Tower of London. You can visit it and see it. It sits behind plates of glass that no bullet could penetrate, right? In other words, this sword is constituted as one of the most important artifacts that England has as its history. Well, let's talk about this. What is going on with this sword? And what's up with the Sword of Kings Excalibur? In the history of England, their Plymouth Rock story, this is the beginning of our history story, begins with a sword. Not just any sword, the Sword of Swords, Excalibur. And a kid, believe it or not, a child, is also a part of this story early on. His name is Arthur. Arthur will look and sound a lot like Beowulf. And there's a lot of debate about whether this guy named Arthur ever actually existed, and if he did exist, did he exist to kind of look and sound like the guy we know of as Arthur? Pretty good chance, probably not. The story of King Arthur and the knights, the Knights of the Round Table, become the central story of English history. But it isn't a story that they themselves derive. It is a story of antiquity. It actually begins, of course, with the great Roman stories and Greek stories. In other words, you can't really understand the story of King Arthur without understanding Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, and any number of other stories as well, right? The notion of weaponry being so vital. For example, in the Greek tradition, there's the famous story of Ajax. After Achilles dies with that shot to the ankle, the debate is who will get his armor. Because to have the armor of Achilles would be, of course, a big dog deal. A guy named Ajax wants it. Odysseus is given it. Ajax gets so mad that he goes to the tent of Odysseus, drags him out of the tent after killing all of Odysseus's men, takes Odysseus into his tent, ties him up to the center post, and beats him all night long to death with a piece of wood, with a bat. And you can hear Odysseus just screaming all over the camp. No one messes with Ajax, he's such a terrible warrior. In the morning, Ajax finally wakes up from his exhausted sleep, and there's dead sheep lying everywhere. Thousands of dead sheep lying everywhere, and a large ram has been tied to the center of his tent post and has been beaten, brutally beaten to death with a bat, and of course Ajax covered in blood. In a moment, he realizes the gods have fooled him, and he has dishonored himself and his family. And he does what is, for the Greeks, a no-no. For the Romans, okay, but for the Greeks, a no-no. He kills himself. For the Romans, that's a good thing, to kill yourself. It shows honor. For the Greeks, not so much. Think about that story and what it means. He kills himself because he wanted a sword. I mean, looked at from the outside looking in, you're like, what is wrong with you people? And yet from a very early point, having a certain sword or certain weapons becomes really important. By the time of Beowulf, a sword is what Beowulf has to have on his body as he goes to fight against the wicked witch of that, underlayer, that nasty place. Our story then will begin with a sword. We'll want to tell about the Arthurian motif. That is to say, the storyline that we will usually refer to as King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. The origination of the source work here is difficult. It's problematic. Not unlike what we called the Troy Tale. Remember part 4 of Edith Hamilton's mythology is kind of that amalgamation or bringing together of a whole bunch of strands of storyline. The same is true for King Arthur and the King Arthur motif. The probably single best place, and it's the ground from which I'll draw most of my observations, is from a book that I highly recommend that you have in your library going forward called Bulfinch's Mythology. Bulfinch was a classical scholar, not unlike Hamilton. And he's kind of like the early form of Cliff Notes for King Arthur and the Song of Roland and the stories and songs of poetry of Charlemagne. All of that is comprised in this volume. You can get it in paperback. So the first time that you see that in a used bookstore, remember it's a strange name so it can stick out. Bulfinch's Mythology. You may want to purchase that. It's not a bad volume to have in your library. I, of course, would recommend that you sit down at some point and read it for the same reason I recommend you read Edith Hamilton's Mythology. There's just a whole lot of different stories that are brought to a single place. Let's talk now about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. I want to do two things in my lecture now. One, I want to give you the overarching storyline, and then I want to finish with some observations about the importance of the Arthurian motif, not only in the English mindset, but also in the American mindset. Let's begin, first of all, with the story. All of the stories about King Arthur, though, have a certain kind of linear understanding, okay? And I want to outline that for you. Who was King Arthur and why should I care? It's another way to ask the question. King Arthur is the greatest king in the history of English history, okay? He's the greatest king. Now, there's a huge debate about whether this cat actually ever really lived or not. Certainly, a whole lot of the stories attributed to him are made up, okay? And when we start talking about King Arthur, we're going to see a lot of Beowulf there, which will not surprise us. We're going to see a whole lot of earlier epic heroes there, like Achilles, like Odysseus. No doubt, we're going to see those kind of heroes as well. When we look at this story, the first thing we want to say is that it has multiple originations. In other words, it's not like one person sat down and wrote the story about King Arthur. These are multiple stories drawn from multiple sources. One of our key sources is a cat named Mallory, okay, who will tell about this famous warrior fighter. Okay? So who is this guy? Well, his story, his life story is quite fascinating. Okay? It kind of happens in 3 phases. First of all, there's the whole element of his birth. We'll talk about it in some detail in a moment. Secondly, there's the story of his rise to power, what we will call the famous sword in the stone. See, some of you have been introduced to this many years ago through some kind of Disney film or something like that. Then finally, there's the downfall of Arthur. And that's a huge part of it. Included in the downfall of Arthur is what we will call sometimes the redemption of Arthur. And that, of course, has to do with the Holy Cup of Christ or the Holy Grail and the search for the Holy Grail. Now, a number of you have seen Monty Python's satiric spoof on the quest for the Holy Grail and all of that, but you didn't maybe completely comprehend all of the joking that was a part of that. Strange women lying in ponds is no basis for a system of government and all of that kind of thing. Once you know this storyline, you'll be able to watch Monty Python's Holy Grail and enjoy it on a number of different levels that right now probably you can't enjoy. You just don't know the storyline. So let's go through it. First of all, who is King Arthur? Part 1. Arthur has a great father who is a king, but there's a problem. This king has tremendous desire for a woman who is not his wife. He wants a woman named Igraine, who's a beautiful woman. However, she's already married to another king. For those of you that say, wow, this sounds a whole lot like that story from the Greek epic where Paris steals the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, you got it. Arthur, much like many of the great heroes of antiquity, comes from dubious parentage. Arthur's father will sleep with a woman who is not his wife. His father will use magic to seduce the woman. That magic is provided by the great wizard Merlin. And he plays a really important role in our story. King Arthur is conceived. Okay. Our story begins with a great warrior. His name is Uther, Pendragon. Everything works well until Uther sees a woman. Now this is always going to be a part of this story. Beautiful women mess up men's heads. And sure enough, this is what happens. Uther sees a beautiful woman. Just so happens to be the wife of the man that he just had the ceasefire with. He wants this woman, and so he uses Merlin's magic to change his shape to look like Igraine's husband. The agreement between Uther and Merlin is that whatever comes out of this union, Merlin gets it. What will come out of this union will be the child, Arthur. This is significant for your notes. Arthur is born a bastard. That is huge. He has dubious parentage. In other words, his mother and his father not married. In the process, Igraine's husband dies, leaving Uther and Igraine to be able to marry, and of course the child is born. When Merlin shows up, and Merlin says, you made a deal. It's kind of like making a deal with the devil. You made a deal. The deal is simply this: I want that kid. Igraine, of course, is like, whoa, what's going on? She then realizes that the man that she slept with was not, in fact, her husband, was, in fact, a man changed using magic. The child is taken by Merlin and taken away to be raised by Merlin and a family that he will give give Arthur to. Got me? And Arthur is then raised, much like Paris, he's raised away from his direct family, okay? He is raised by a family of knights. And as a very young man, Arthur is going to be a helper to his brother Kay, another knight. In a very interesting series of events, however, Arthur's father has acquired a very special sword. This sword is called Excalibur. The Sword of Kings, it's called. And the idea is, once you have this sword, you have the right to rule. You have the right to rule. So, where does the sword come from? Well, it actually comes from God, is the way to think of it. It comes from special magic. It comes from the Lady of the Lake, she's referred to, okay? Which is kind of like a deity, spirit that lives in the lake that will appropriate the sword. Arthur's father has this sword. It's what allows him to be able to wield power. The origination of Excalibur is questionable, where it comes from. I mean, we, of course, have the joke from Monty Python's Holy Grail, strange women lying in ponds is no basis for a system of government. And yet, there it is. For the English, That's exactly what gives the legitimacy of power, that sword. Where does that sword come from? Well, it's sometimes called the Sword of Kings, and it's derived from this lake. In other words, some mythic place. By the way, symbolism, very important in the Arthurian motif, because King Arthur and the story of King Arthur is ostensibly a Christian story. And you're going to have all this important symbolism. Threes, or the Trinity, become real important. Water, obviously, very important. If you know anything about Christianity, the sacred rite of baptism obviously plays an important role. Water becomes an important symbol as well. So from this water, from this lake, comes the sword. Arthur's father will take the sword and will stick it inside of a large rock. Ergo, the sword in the stone. And the prophecy then is, whoever draws the sword from the stone will be king. Whoever draws the sword from the stone will be king. And for a long period of time, number of years, no one can draw the sword from the stone. Young Arthur grows up in a house of knights. Now let's talk about knights for a second. These knights follow the code of chivalry. Chivalry. Now what does that word mean? It basically means two things: strength and honor. Strength, good fighters. These knights are great and mighty warriors. They wear armor, they ride on large horses, and they are involved in constant competition. Fighting all the time. Training. Getting ready to compete. They love battles. They love fighting. They're great with weapons of any number of kinds. And they are tremendous horsemen. They can ride a horse and fight at the same time. They can, for example, carry a large lance and try and dehorse or knock off other guys on the horse. They do this training all the time. But it's not just about strength. There's the second one, honor. There is a code of honor that runs something like this. First and foremost, a knight must take care of all women. He will never show a woman disrespect of any kind. If you grew up in a house where you were told guys don't hit girls, that was the code of chivalry. Your parents didn't make that rule up. That rule actually came from this time period where knights show women total respect. Okay? Number two, part of this honor code is a knight fights for his king and queen. He does not fight for himself. He's given a small amount of salary to live off of, but the knight does not fight for himself. He fights for his king or his queen. And if the king or queen says, let's go to fight, immediately do it, and pledging one's death. In other words, whatever it takes. Okay? So these knights have this honor code. Each of these knights in Arthur's time trying to draw his sword from the stone and become the king. Because at the moment, there is no king in the country. The next moment in our story, Arthur is a young man. He's very young, probably in his teens. And he has been raised by another family. Merlin has taken the boy and given him away. Arthur has a brother who he thinks is his, think of Oedipus, right? He thinks this is his real family. His brother Kay is the knight in training, and Arthur is kind of like his helper guy. At a famous jousting contest, Kay loses his sword. In large measure because King Arthur, not yet King Arthur, just a young boy, is negligent and allows for the sword to be stolen. While running after the thief in the middle of the woods, Arthur stumbles upon the sword in the stone. Arthur knows nothing about Excalibur. Really, he doesn't understand much of it at all. The storylines come to us that Arthur's kind of a stupid kid. He's not really much into fighting. He's just there to help. He's what we call a squire. It's there, realizing he isn't going to get Kay's sword back, that he will draw the sword from the rock. He does it effortlessly. He does it. The sword just comes right out of the rock. It's not even like it's work for Arthur. Many men try. None of them can do it. Ironically, King Arthur, as a young boy, is the one who does it. Now, the reason is because he has already been decided by God to be king. In other words, there's something special about this King Arthur. For a brief moment, his brother, Kay, stepbrother, his half-brother, Kay, adopted brother, we would say, will say that he's the one that took the sword out of the stone. But Kay can't lie. And so he says, no, it was Arthur. Arthur? The kid, that scrawny little boy, Arthur? He's the one who draws the sword from the stone? Immediately, Arthur's stepfather tells him, you've done something you shouldn't have done. Put it back. So Arthur does. Oh, okay. Sticks it back into the rock again. Immediately, a number of knights try to draw the sword from the stone because, hurrah, he must have loosened it. Nope, they can't do it. It's at this point that all of the people begin to look at Arthur like, who are you? And immediately Arthur's stepfather, will say, you're not my son. And it's at this point for the first time, much like Oedipus, that Arthur now will be told, what? What do you mean I'm not your son? No, Merlin brought me to you. Merlin brought you to me, and I raised you. Merlin? Arthur asks, what's a Merlin? It's at this point Merlin shows up in the story. And Merlin will in fact say, yeah, you're not even my son. And in this moment, immediately Arthur becomes controversial. That is to say, his father was Uther Pendragon, his mother was Igraine. And immediately there's this debate that happens. Is Arthur the young king? And he's just a young man. In the story, sometimes he's pictured as he's young as 12 or 13 years old. He's just a young boy when you see him for the first time in some of the stories. Arthur immediately is the subject, or the cause, I should say, of a civil war, fighting. Immediately, two sides break out. And immediately you have civil war. So Arthur's beginning of a kingdom and being a king doesn't start out very well. Think here immediately of your understandings from Plato's Republic, right? Arthur's not a very good unifier at all. Immediately, all of these knights take up sides. Half of the knights will support him. The other half of the knights will say, no way, we're not going to have a bastard for a king. There is no way. This stupid young kid, no way. Even if he has Excalibur, no way. And that's an important moment in the story because Arthur must be the great unifier. And that's what he is. Arthur does something very interesting. He shows tremendous heroism, great courage. And when he subdues one of the knights who is fighting against him, the knight says, you have to kill me. I will never ever bow down to you because you are not a knight. To which Arthur will respond, you're absolutely right, I'm not a knight. And he hands over Excalibur to his enemy, and he says, you're a knight, use Excalibur and knight me to make me a knight. Well, in the moment he hands over the sword, obviously there's the opportunity for the opponent to just take the sword, run with it, and become the king. But in an important moment, Arthur seems to understand something in his innocent spirit about what it is to lead and gain loyalty. He gains immediately the loyalty of his enemy who says, something's going on here. You must have the blood of Uther Pendragon in you. Uther, of course, is Arthur's father. And I will knight you, and then I will be your loyal knight. It's at this moment, then, that Arthur will begin his rise to prominence. So let's say it this way. One of the things that makes Arthur so important in the image and the mind of the English people is that he is the great unifier. He brings together all of the disparate families and bands of men. He unites them. He conquers all of known Britain. Ultimately, they decide, wow, this is some kind of king, and they decide to give up allegiance to him. By the way, there will be huge debate about whether this cat actually ever lived, much like the debate about whether there ever really was a Beowulf, and so on and so forth, right? These are big debates that are, they're resolvable by academics. But for our discussions here, it's not that big of a deal one way or the other, because we're really focused on the story itself. upon uniting everyone, Arthur does, let's call it 2, yea, 3 things that are really important next. Once he subdues the country, he does 3 things. One, he decides he's going to marry. Her name is Guinevere, and he's going to marry this beautiful girl who he has fallen in love with. Merlin has warned Arthur about this girl. He has said, you know, you got to be really careful about women, and especially this girl, and I kind of have a bad feeling about the future, and a very important friend is going to betray you. But when you're in love, you can't hear. Love is deaf as well as blind, it's said in the story, and Arthur can't hear. All he can see is Guinevere there dancing around the flames, you see, and of course that's enough for him, and he's smitten and all of that. So, you know, he's like, sweet. He even asks Merlin, can you make her love me? And Merlin gets really offended, and he's like, look, no more of that. I already did that once, and it didn't turn out very well for all parties involved. No, I'm not making you, using magic. You know, you got to do this one on your own, son. Arthur is able to do it on his own, and he gets the girl. The second important thing that he does is he says, I'm going to build a city. It will be the city of my kingship, and it will become the most important city in all of England, Britain, and we'll call it Camelot. It's only a model. Okay? Now, for those of you who, by the way, for those of you who watch Monty Python's Holy Grail, it is an incredibly intellectual performance. It's comedy, of course, on some level, but it's really, I mean, every single line is carrying double and even triple meanings. Camelot is a model. It is absolutely a model. It is the model city. It is pure Plato writ at large. If you could invent the perfect city, what would it look like? The answer is Camelot. That's the name of it, Camelot. And they just build it. He just builds it. The idea is he just clears a plain and he builds this city from nothing. It's a famous city because it's the city where King Arthur himself will live, and it's the city where he will provide the rules, the governing power for all of the different principalities and kind of small states and that type of thing. Then Arthur builds a castle. He puts it right in the heart of this city, Camelot. This is an amazing castle. None ever seen so beautiful. Years later, there will be cities that will be built, constructed with this notion in mind, where you will put a religious icon, a temple, a castle, a sacred building in the dead center of the town, and then around that you will build the rest of the city. That's exactly what Camelot is. Then, in the center of the castle, a special room, the room of the king. Inside of that special meeting hall, think of course of Hrothgar's famous hall in Beowulf, huh? Inside that special room, there will be a table, not just any table. Now the origin of whether this idea comes from Arthur or from Merlin is in much debate. Be that as it may, the table is not square, it is round. Now the reason that the round table is so important is because when you have a square table, you have an identifiable place where the head of the table sits. Depending on how you lay the table out, the end closest to the throne is the end where the king would sit. In other words, he's in charge. What's significant about a round table? We have our first introduction of political ideology called democracy. You could argue that in many ways, Arthur is the first step towards the notion all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And it is iconically represented with a round table. When he is sitting at that table along with his knights, he is equal to them. Of course, Excalibur lays on the table as the sword of kings to give Arthur the power. In other words, he has the power to tell everybody what to do, but he doesn't wield that power in that way. Rather, he is a great king. He is what we would call gracious. He gives his knights the opportunity to be equal with him. They have a voice. They can actually disagree with him and stuff. Notice in allowing that kind of belief, Arthur immediately becomes the most beloved leader in the history of Britain. Instead of putting himself above all others, a la Machiavelli's prince, and saying, I will rule through fear, I will rule through edict and command, Arthur places himself as an equal with the other knights, and in so doing, gains their ultimate love and loyalty. The King Arthur motif answers Machiavelli's view, it's better to be feared than loved. Arthur answers that with garbage. It's far better to be loved. I will prove it. And the way you gain the love of your knights is to say, we're all equals when we sit at this table. Your voice and your opinion, every bit as important as mine. That's a monumental moment in the history of political thought. Whether it actually ever occurred that there really was a city called Camelot, and we don't know. And whether there actually ever occurred a real table called the Round Table, the idea for English people will become foundational to the way they think about politics in England. In other words, this is a symbol that will become forever a symbol. And all of a sudden, notice the symbolism of this story. It begins with a sword, Excalibur, but Arthur uses the sword to gain unity, and then he constructs the important next symbol, that round table, where when you're sitting at that table, you're all equals. That becomes a pivotal moment in political thought. Notice Arthur didn't have to do this. We're back to the myth of Gyges and that ring. Arthur has the sword of total power. He could defeat all of the other guys with that sword, and he could rule as a despot, as a tyrant. He could do that. He doesn't do it. He consciously chooses otherwise, and in that moment, he gains their loyalty and their love. They would never, ever want to let him down. So, I mean, at this point in our story, let's just say it out loud. Arthur is having a great life, right? He's got a beautiful city named Camelot. He's got a democratic understanding of rule. All of his knights love him deeply because he's given them the freedom of equality. And he's got this drop-dead gorgeous woman who is his wife and hopefully will bear him a son so that the kingdom will be able to have an heir. Yay! Everything is going perfect. So the first part of our story is the rise of King Arthur and the drawing of the Sword of the Stone. The second part of our story is Arthur's building of Camelot, and more particularly that special room with that special table. And now the third part of our story, and this is kind of the tragic part of our story, and yet it's kind of inevitable. Arthur has a close pal. He's the greatest fighting man in all of Arthur's realm. He's far superior to King Arthur as a fighter. His name is Lancelot. Now what's interesting is Lancelot is not actually English. He's actually from France. And he's tremendously gifted with the sword. He can fight really well. At first, Lancelot is such a great fighter that he cannot be defeated. Ultimately, are you ready for this? Arthur has to go one-on-one with Lancelot. Arthur calls on the power of Excalibur in one version of the story, and Arthur defeats Lancelot, but in so doing, he breaks Excalibur. He breaks the sword to defeat the great knight Lancelot. Two things happen out of this. One, immediately there's a problem if the sword is broken. Merlin will counsel Arthur to return the sword to the Lady of the Lake. She will reconfigure or rebuild the sword. The famous line by Merlin is, "You have broken what cannot be broken." This will become an indicator of a forecast to come, that perfect harmony, idyllic unity inevitably wrecks on the rocks of disharmony, and it's coming. But the Lady of the Lake returns to Arthur Excalibur mended. Okay, so it's now his sword again. The second important thing is that Lancelot has been bested. And instead of kind of wandering off into the wilderness to be sad about that fact and lament for the rest of his days that he's been bested, he immediately devotes the rest of his life to Arthur. I will forever fight for you. And we understand something through this story called chivalry. Now that's an interesting word, chivalry. That word means loyalty to the king and queen. If you are a knight, you go through a process where ultimately you are knighted. You would kneel in front of the king. The king would use this special sword Excalibur. He's going to touch both shoulders and the top of your head. And then you become a knight. What does that mean? For the rest of your life, you pledge loyalty to the king and to the queen. In other words, you basically defend him, you fight for him, you fight until you die. Lancelot says, that's what I will do. So now Arthur has gained the greatest warrior of all time. Lancelot is an amazing knight. He outfights all of the other knights. He's strong. He's a great and mighty fighter. Are you ready for this? He is drop dead gorgeous. Women look at Lancelot and immediately want to be with Lancelot. His only response is, what can I say? That's his response. What can I say? Unfortunately, Arthur is quite brilliant and beautiful and handsome, but he is nothing compared to Lancelot. Lancelot is drop dead gorgeous. In fact, there are stories of girls seeing him and fainting at sight. He is that stunningly handsome. We'll even hear the story of the Lady of Shalott, who completely will ruin her life just for one chance to see him. He has what Max Weber later will call tremendous charisma. He can walk into a room and immediately govern the room by nothing other than his looks and the energy that kind of extends from those looks. If you will, he's the first Brad Pitt, you see. When he shows up, everyone's just kind of like immediately taken by him. And when Lancelot shows up, Arthur's wife, Guinevere, immediately goes, who is that and can I get his cell number, you see? And it doesn't take long before we have the famous love triangle, right? Lancelot pledges his undying loyalty to Arthur, and then he turns around and he sleeps with Arthur's wife, Guinevere. Sure enough, there is a tryst. There is a little hanky-pankying going on. And ultimately, this will become the source of some serious problems for Arthur. But Arthur's problems are only beginning. If you will, right at the moment when everything is going the best, Camelot begins to fragment, to fall apart. Arthur can't kill Lancelot, he can't kill Guinevere because he loves both of them. Lancelot's his best pal, Guinevere's his wife. What are you going to do? There's another interesting part of our story, though. When Arthur's father, Uther, slept with Igraine, Igraine already had a daughter. Her name, Morgana. Morgana is our witch of the Arthurian motif. She is not at all pleased that Merlin used magic to ostensibly allow for Arthur to be born and for her daddy to be killed. So Morgana has a desire to unseat Arthur. And as she has gotten older, Morgana has started to hang out with Merlin. She wants to know Merlin's famous charms, his famous spells. Morgana uses one of those famous spells. She makes herself to look like Guinevere, and she sleeps with Arthur. Now, Arthur is sleeping with his half-sister. For those of you who say, serious dysfunctional family going on here. Yeah, but much like Oedipus, Arthur doesn't know that he's sleeping with his sister. She uses magic to kind of change the way she looks. Notice how in this story, it seems like irresponsible sex leads to all kinds of problems. Do you see that mentioned? It seems like a theme in this story, right? Okay, so here we go. Arthur sleeps with his half-sister, Morgana. Out of this union will come the son of Arthur. His name is Mordred. Mordred is our B-A-D bad villain of our story, and he is nasty. The reason he's nasty is because Morgana uses magic to make him a terribly evil person. Morgana's idea is very simple and very Machiavellian. She's going to use Mordred to take over the kingdom. Mordred absolutely has no problem with this, and technically speaking, it's okay because Mordred is the son of a king, and therefore has the right to be the king. All he has to do is just get rid of Arthur. When he goes into battle, he does not die. He does not die. He fights great, but he's really evil. He is a true villain. If you've ever watched a film where the bad guy is just straight out bad guy. There's nothing redeeming about him. He'll kill anybody, he'll jack anybody, and he doesn't care about loyalties of any kind. That's Mordred. So notice that Arthur begins to now have serious problems. Let's point it out. This is one of the foundational elements of this motif. You have this pristine moment in history when there's perfect unity. When he wins and he builds Camelot, it can't get any better. And it's at that moment, when things are absolutely perfect, Arthur starts to have his problems. First with Lancelot and his wife Guinevere. Then secondly with his stepsister Morgana and their product son Mordred. But that's not all. 3. Arthur becomes sick. And he begins to die. Now you could make the argument that this is just stress-induced illness, long-term chronic stress-induced illness, whatever it is. As he dies, the land of England also starts to die. Literally, it literally starts to die. Crops don't grow. There is a famine in the land. It's a bad deal. Merlin, however, will say, the problem is he must drink from the Holy Grail, the cup of Christ, the famous cup of Christ. Now, what is that all about? Well, in mythic literature, there is this notion that when Christ is crucified on the cross, there is an individual who has a cup or a grail there sitting at the base of the cross who actually has some blood of Christ drop into the cup. To drink from that cup will provide you with eternal life, everlasting life. In other words, you don't die. You're forever young. For those of you who saw the 3rd of the Indiana Jones film, you know all about this at the very end when they drink from the famous cup of Christ, okay? So now we have, as part of the Arthurian motif, the famous quest for the Holy Cup or Holy Grail. Grail is just another word for cup, okay? The journey motif of the knights is to find the Holy Grail, the cup of Christ. Bring it back to Arthur so that Arthur can drink from the cup of Christ. This will lead to the famous middle third of the story where these knights all go out looking for this cup of Christ. Of course, there's famous knights. All of these knights are well known in mythology. The one we must mention here, of course, is Percival, because Percival is the one who finds the cup. He's known because he's very pure in heart. And in finding the cup of Christ, he also discovers the secret of the cup of Christ. The secret is phrased often in the form of a single line. As goes the king, so goes the state. Another way to say this is the king and the land are one. Now this is foundational to understanding the English view of government. Their idea is, if you have a good king, it sounds very Platonist, doesn't it? If you have a good king, you will have a healthy country. And by the way, when we use the word healthy here, we don't just mean politically healthy, we mean literally healthy. That is to say the crops will grow. That is to say good things happen. The English people are very suspicious about bad weather. If they feel like there's bad weather that's long-term, like famine or whatever, or the plague, it's probably because their king or their ruler is a bad king or ruler. But if we have a healthy king, we will have a healthy state. And that's the secret of the cup of Christ. And of course, the English will use this going both directions, right? So for example, when things are going well, that's proof. Obviously, we have a good king. When things are going bad, I don't know. What's up with our king? Maybe our king needs to repent to God and to the church and, make amends or whatever. Think about how different a view that is, for example, from the American democratic notion that every 4 years, as will happen tomorrow again, you can always vote, and that is to say, change your leadership. You have the capacity to change whatever it is that you don't like. That's a different view from the English view, and King Arthur will be the instantiator of that view. Percival finds the cup, it's brought back to Arthur, Arthur drinks from the cup, and is immediately rejuvenated, awakens to find that his kingdom is in shambles because Mordred is about to take over. And this leads to the final third of the story, the final day of King Arthur, the final days of King Arthur, where ultimately Arthur must do 2 things. He must come face to face with his son, Mordred, and he's going to have to defeat him and kill him. So now notice we have the famous motif of father killing son and son killing father. Arthur and Mordred come face to face in the famous final moment. I should point out that in this famous battle, several important things happen, not least of which Lancelot re-enters the fray and he dies helping save Arthur. So, in some ways their friendship is restored. In the meantime, by the way, Guinevere has gone off to live in a nunnery. She actually took Excalibur with her. Arthur thought he had lost the sword. And she returns the sword to Arthur after he's drank from the Holy Grail, allowing him to be able to fight against his son. Until finally, Arthur and his son come face to face. They're both pictured as just being covered in blood and guts. Arthur still having Excalibur in his hand, Mordred having this long spear in his hand. And they come towards each other, and Arthur's voice says to him, "Father, let us embrace," or hug. The son will drive a spear into Arthur's body. It will go in and out the other side. And Mordred feels like he's won, but not so. Arthur is a great and mighty warrior. He pulls the spear through his body, walks down to the end where his son is holding the spear, and using Excalibur, he kills his own son. In that process, two things. One, obviously he's killed the successor to the throne. It's his only son. And secondly, Arthur just bought the farm. He ain't coming back from this one. Even the power of Excalibur cannot save Arthur. He must die. But he's not quite dead. Now we're back to the final words of Beowulf, where, remember, Beowulf has said, that I gotta speak a few words and I gotta make some kind of predictions before I go. It's interesting for Arthur, though, what he decides to do is something quite different. He calls his close servant to him, Bedivere. And he says to Bedivere, "I want you to take Excalibur over to this lake and I want you to throw it in the lake." And Bedivere's like, "That's all you want me to do? That's what I need you to do." Hands Excalibur to him, the Sword of Kings. Well, Bedivere walks over to the lake. He can't do it. He comes back and he says to King Arthur, "Okay, I did it." And Arthur says, "What happened when you threw the sword into the lake?" And he says, a little bit of air, water on the, or wind on the water. And Arthur goes, "You're lying to me. You didn't do it." Bedivere's like, "I can't do it." He said, "You got to do it." One more time, Bedivere goes and tries to throw. He gets ready to throw. He can't do it. It's like, the sword's worth millions of dollars, right, kind of thing. It's a priceless sword. Can't do it. Comes back, lies one more time to Arthur. Arthur's like, "You got to have faith in me. Do it. Go and throw it into the lake and watch what happens." And sure enough, when he tosses that sword into the lake, it doesn't hit the water. A hand comes out of the water and actually grabs the sword. It's the lady of the lake. And she will take the sword back into the water. And he hurries back to tell King Arthur, "Hurrah, I did it." And man, something really bizarre happened. Arthur's gone. His body's not there. His body has already been taken to a ship where it is sailing away. Finally, they have to say where Arthur went, so they construct a grave. Bedivere sits next to the grave. On the stone sitting over the grave are the words, "King Arthur, once and future king." That's important for your notes. King Arthur, once and future king. Now, this is the messianic quality of this motif. What do I mean by messianic? Related to the word Messiah. That is to say, he who shall return. The idea is for Arthur, I was here, I was a great king, I died, but I am coming back. And the idea then is, when you have a great king coming back, he will personify in many ways the greatest of the kings of England, King Arthur. Okay? Now there's several extensions to this motif. One of them is the simple notion that we will understand by 1600 when Shakespeare is writing his plays, as goes the king, so goes the state. That's a really important line, and it's one that we want to write down. As goes the king, so goes the state. When we study our Shakespeare here in a few weeks, we're going to look at the play Macbeth. And one of the things we're going to point out is that Shakespeare, already by 1600, some 300 years after the creation of this story, Shakespeare already knew and understood this idea. If you have a good king, you have a really good state. But if you have a crummy king, then you have a really crummy state. The idea is simple. Arthur will return in England's greatest moment to somehow give England back its glory. He will come back. This is often what we refer to as the messianic theme of the Arthurian motif. The idea of the return of the king, right? The idea that the king will come back and save us. This notion sits really strongly in the minds of the English as we approach the year 1776 and beyond. The colonists who signed the Declaration of Independence are acutely aware of this motif and the importance of the king. That's why it's so significant that when Washington is voted the President of the United States, this huge debate ensues about what to call him. Because there's a number of those intellectuals who signed the Declaration of Independence who want Washington to be the new Arthur. There were many who wanted to call him King Washington. It made sense. They're English. They come out of a background where you name your leader a king. Washington was really opposed to it. Boy, it says something about the man, doesn't it? He was really opposed to being called a king. No, let's just call our leader a president and not a king. And there are some who whisper, I mean, can you find a better candidate for King Arthur than Washington? Think about why that would work. He is a tremendous fighter. He is a remarkable leader. And he's unbelievably humble. I mean, you can't find those three traits in most great leaders. Notice the debate then for Washington is a simple one. No, I don't want to be called a king. I don't want us to consider presidents as kings. And in the American mentality, you're president or leader for a certain period of time. And then there is a vote that takes place, and you either continue to be the leader or you don't continue to be the leader. That's quite different from the English understanding of the monarchy. That's not to say, however, that we in America have not been heavily influenced by this motif. Let me give you an example. Arguably one of the most popular presidents in the history of the presidency was a guy named John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was an interesting cat for a number of reasons. When he was elected to office, he was the youngest president. He came into office as a young man with a young, beautiful wife and children. He was a very private individual, and he didn't allow lots and lots of photographs. However, he did allow for Time Life magazine to come and visit one of his many estates. They were a very wealthy family, and they took photographs of him. Some of you have maybe seen these photographs. He's sailing in his yacht. He's throwing a football. He's sitting next to his pool with his beautiful wife and his children. He's playing with his children. These photographs were very famous because they showed him as being kind of a normal guy, human, etc., etc. When Time Life published these magazines, that edition of Time Life was the top selling up to that point. On the cover of that magazine were the words, "A return to Camelot." No kidding. That's how Time Life introduced Kennedy. A return to Camelot. Now, if you're a reader of that magazine and you understand your Arthurian motif, guess what? You understand exactly what's being said. Why would Kennedy be associated with the King Arthur motif? Well, one of his major agendas was to try to bring together the American people across especially racial lines, correct? We were about to have the major civil rights movement. It was just building. Of course, we know the story and how it ends for Kennedy. He is assassinated on the streets of Dallas, right? And in that moment, many argued that there was a great potential presidency about to happen, and it was snuffed out by death. You see how this works. This motif then continues to be really influential in the way a lot of people think. Just to give you one more hint of this, when President Obama was elected president, he took a trip to England. Before he arrived in England, in the newspapers, there were already lots and lots of photographs of President Obama and his wife, Michelle Obama, about to get off the plane. And there were several headlines that said, "The New Arthur." This is English journalists calling him this, the new Arthur. Now, I'm not debating with you your views on politics and whether you're a supporter of the president and his policies or not. I will say, however, that in the early year of his presidency, there was tremendous optimism in Europe about
President Obama as again being what? Well, if you're playing with the King Arthur motif, the thing that makes him important is he's got to be a unifier, a guy that brings everybody together. So foundational to this motif, now to finish the lecture and for your notes, King Arthur is a great and mighty king because he is the great unifier. He is the great democratizer. His round table is that powerful symbol. He also, of course, wields Excalibur, which gives him the right to be king. But finally, the Arthurian motif also involves tragedy, right? The downfall. That is to say, he can't always keep his house in order. He loses his wife to his best friend, and then ultimately, through magic, he sleeps with his half-sister and produces a son who ultimately will kill him. And so you have kind of the downside as well. It makes him a fully tragic figure. And yet, for the English, this is the most important story for them because it tells where their kings kind of derived from. And every king then is measured against King Arthur as the great unifier.